She slammed the cash down like it was filth, then flicked it off the counter with 2 fingers, letting thousands of dollars spill across the floor in front of him. Just because he was black. No apology, no eye contact, just a smirk and a turn back, as if his presence alone was an insult. He didn't speak, didn't argue, didn't bend to the shame they tried to wrap around him. But every eye in that bank was watching, judging, deciding he didn't belong. They had no idea who they were trying to break. This isn't just about racism, it's about what happens when the one you try to humiliate has the power to destroy you without ever raising his voice. If that hit you, like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what you felt the moment she pushed that money to the floor. Christian Avery stepped out of the black car with the kind of stillness people often misread as hesitation. He didn't rush. He didn't shuffle. He simply stood for a moment, adjusting the collar of his dark overcoat against the morning chill. The streets around the Continental Union Bank were already alive with a quiet rhythm of wealth. Clicking shoes, creased suits, the rustle of polished leather briefcases swinging in tempo with hurried ambition. Christian didn't move with that rhythm. He moved slower, intentionally, like he had nothing to prove and no need to catch up. His shoes, mirror-polished and made by hand, stepped onto the pavement like they belonged nowhere and everywhere. He paused before the glass doors, looking up at the embossed gold letters spelling out the bank's name. For a breath or two, he simply watched the movement inside. People lining up, suits crossing, heads down, schedules ticking. Then he pushed the door open with a measured hand and walked into a storm of marble, chrome, and cold light. The bank's interior looked like wealth had been frozen in time. It was too clean, too sterile, too perfect. Everything gleamed. Floors polished like mirrors. Walls tiled in stone that caught the light just right. Every surface invited admiration while subtly discouraging touch. Christian walked through it like he belonged there, which only made the stares come quicker. Not direct ones, not aggressive, just the quiet flick of glances that said too much. He approached the teller row, where 6 perfectly aligned stations waited beneath a brushed aluminum beam. Behind the third counter, under a small brass plaque with her name etched in careful script, stood Cheryl Denning. She looked up the moment Christian reached her line. There was no welcome in her eyes. Her face stayed calm, composed, untouched by warmth. Her gaze moved across Christian's face, lingered on the thread pattern of his collar, the aged scarring on the backs of his hands, then dropped to his coat sleeve where a barely noticeable wrinkle disrupted the symmetry. That was all it took. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. She'd already decided who he was. Not worth her smile, not worth time. Just another mistake walking upright. Christian didn't flinch. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded withdrawal slip, placing it on the counter with the ease of someone completing a routine task. The motion was steady, polite, silent. He placed his ID on top of it, a valid form of identification. Not flashy, not forged, just a fact. Cheryl didn't touch it right away. She leaned slightly forward and tilted her head as if squinting through glass at something unpleasant. Her fingers hovered, hesitant, before finally picking up the slip by the edge, pinched between her thumb and the tip of one polished nail like it might leave residue. She glanced at the figure written on the paper. Her lips parted. She didn't speak, not at first. She looked at Christian again, this time with less hesitation and more judgment. Then she turned her eyes toward the security desk across the atrium. She didn't wave them over, not yet, but the glance was enough to signal her discomfort. Still silent, she unfolded the slip entirely and reread the number. 7 digits. Nothing criminal about it. Nothing illegal. Just large enough to provoke disbelief. Or, in Cheryl's case, offense. Christian stood patiently, hands relaxed, shoulders square, breathing even. Cheryl finally spoke, but the words came out with that crisp, flat edge reserved for someone explaining policy to a stubborn child. She questioned the withdrawal, asked if he was sure, suggested that she'd need additional verification, not because protocol demanded it, because her tone made clear she didn't trust him. Christian didn't reply right away. He nodded once softly. His eyes stayed level, calm. Cheryl blinked like she hadn't expected him to accept the insults so easily. She turned sharply, papers in hand, and walked away toward the back offices without another word. Her heels clicked too loud on the marble. The sound echoed in the quiet like punctuation marks on a conversation only she was having. Christian stood there, unmoving, waiting. From the corner of his eye, he noticed the shift in posture behind him. People were looking now, pretending not to, but still looking. A woman with a shopping bag adjusted her stance so she could glance his way. A man behind her checked his watch and frowned in deliberate exaggeration. Someone coughed with a little too much emphasis. And still, Christian said nothing. Cheryl returned nearly 10 minutes later, holding the slip like it was something sticky. She didn't make eye contact. She folded the slip into thirds and slid it toward him across the counter. The movement looked harmless, but the way she pushed it made it clear she didn't want it on her side of the glass any longer than necessary. She informed him, in that same clipped tone, that the transaction needed further review. He'd have to wait, perhaps step aside. There was a space near the lobby, past the columns, by the brochure rack. He could wait there. Christian reached for the paper, but the folded slip slipped just past his fingers, fluttering off the counter and onto the ground like a crumpled receipt. Cheryl didn't react, didn't apologize, didn't even pretend to. Christian knelt to retrieve it. As he did, the edge of his coat brushed against the floor near a recently watered planter. When he stood again, a small dark stain clung to the fabric near his waist. He looked at it for a beat, then folded the slip into his pocket and walked toward the designated waiting space. Not a bench, not a seat, just a hollow near the brochures, designed to be stood in, stared through, and forgotten. He stood there, ignored, occasionally glanced at. He didn't pace. He didn't fidget. He didn't speak. Security didn't approach, but they didn't stop watching either. An older man in a blue blazer walked past and gave him the once-over, then chuckled softly under his breath as he turned the corner. A woman in a pencil skirt snapped her gum and smirked as she passed. Christian took it all in silently, like fog settling around a lake. Quiet, but cold. 15 minutes became 30, then 45. Cheryl never looked his way. The counter served new customers, their smiles greeted, their paperwork stamped without delay. When the guard finally approached, it wasn't with aggression. It was worse. He spoke with a kind of slow condescension that assumed Christian was confused, asked him to confirm why he was there, suggested that perhaps there'd been a mistake. Christian gave the same answer he had given Cheryl, voice low and neutral. The guard nodded like he was agreeing with a child who had insisted the moon was made of cheese, then walked away. Cheryl met his glance across the floor and rolled her eyes. The manager, barely visible behind frosted glass, stayed seated. Cheryl glanced over at him once, not with concern or duty, but with that blank efficiency that people wear when checking the status of something they don't value. She turned away before their eyes could meet, shifting her attention to the next customer, a man in a tailored blue blazer who smiled as he dropped his Rolex-laden wrist on the counter. Cheryl beamed, complimented his cufflinks, and laughed at a joke no one else heard. Christian watched her lips curve and stretch, watched her face come alive in a way it never had for him. He remained still, the cold paper against his palm reminding him of its futility. The bank had grown busier. People streamed in, contractors in steel-toe boots, lawyers in black coats, young professionals balancing coffee cups and conference calls. Christian faded into the background like wallpaper. At one point, a janitor pushed a wheeled cart by him, paused, and made a point of nudging the bin closer as if Christian might mistake it for a seat. He didn't react. He hadn't sat down. He hadn't shifted. Stillness had become his shield. His silence wasn't resignation, it was precision. But no one in the bank could read silence. They only read surfaces. Cheryl eventually motioned to a colleague, leaned close to whisper, and the colleague turned to look directly at Christian. The second teller, a man with sharp cheekbones and close-cut hair, nodded, then made a call on his desk phone. Moments later, A manager in a dark vest emerged from the back hallway. He approached Christian with a strained smile, one practiced for complaints or accidental overdrafts, not high-value clients. His voice was slow, careful, and beneath it ran the assumption that Christian had somehow misunderstood the situation. The manager explained that further verification was needed, that the transaction would take longer than anticipated, and that Christian might want to come back another day. Christian listened. He nodded. He didn't agree, but he didn't resist either. When the manager asked if he'd be comfortable filling out an additional form to clarify the origin of his funds, Christian took the paper without a word. It wasn't a request, they both knew that. It was a message. While Christian filled in the new form, standing with the clipboard braced against the wall, Cheryl watched from her counter. She wasn't hiding her glances anymore. There was something in her face that had moved past caution and into confidence, as if she now understood she was dealing with someone beneath the system's protection. He wasn't loud. He wasn't pushy. He wasn't rich enough to command immediate respect, and he wasn't poor enough to be feared. He was the worst thing a man could be in this place, alone, polite, and black. When Christian finished the form, he returned to the counter, standing quietly behind a short line. Cheryl ignored him, even when the customer in front of him moved aside. She made him wait until she was ready. When she finally took the paper, she didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything. She took the form with the same pinched fingers, skimmed it with minimal effort, then placed it face down on the counter like a coaster. Christian remained. He didn't speak. She tapped her keyboard without urgency, then called over another colleague to confirm something that didn't need confirming. The colleague, a younger woman with red glasses and a sympathetic tilt in her expression, approached the counter and glanced at Christian, then at the form. She began asking questions, softly, apologetically, but Cheryl cut her off and said something under her breath that Christian couldn't quite hear. Whatever it was changed the girl's posture. She nodded, whispered something back, and walked away with hurried steps. Cheryl returned to her screen, typing slowly, the sound of the keys deliberately louder than necessary. A child nearby asked his mother why the man in the corner was still standing. The mother hushed him and led him toward the teller row. Christian didn't react. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, but said nothing. It wasn't until nearly an hour had passed that Cheryl called out his name again. Her tone was flat, perfunctory. She told him they were still processing the transaction, and that the funds in question triggered an internal review due to their size. It was protocol, she said. Nothing personal. But her eyes didn't match her words. They had the shine of someone enjoying a game she was sure she couldn't lose. Christian asked if she needed any additional documentation. His voice was calm, precise. She waved it off, saying that it would be handled internally. She didn't look up when she said it, her painted smile returning for the next customer, her voice lifting an octave to welcome those who matched her preferred design of affluence. Her nails clicked rhythmically against the keyboard as she processed small deposits and answered mundane questions. Yet she never once acknowledged the man she had banished to the edges of the lobby like a forgotten object. Every second Christian stood there was another invitation to embarrassment, and the bank's patrons were more than willing to RSVP. A middle-aged woman wearing pearls and perfume that entered the room like a fog turned toward him with narrowed eyes, as if he had tracked in something foul from a street. She clutched her handbag a little closer to her body and walked a little faster past him, her heels ticking across the tile with urgency. A group of 3 young interns walked through the double doors from the executive wing, all laughter and swagger, their tailored jackets too clean and their shoes too loud. One of them glanced at Christian and nudged his friend, whispering with a crooked grin before turning his attention back to whatever trivial story had amused them. Christian noticed, but did not react. His face remained unreadable, but inside, the weight of the room pressed harder against his chest with each passing second. His silence had started as a choice, but now it felt more like a trap. Just past noon, the lobby grew louder with the swell of lunchtime traffic. More people entered, more transactions began, and the lines thickened with impatient sighs and buzzing conversations. Still Christian stood alone, his presence somehow invisible and disruptive at the same time. Then, finally, Cheryl summoned him forward again with the same lifeless tone she had used before. He approached slowly, not with hesitation, but caution, like a man walking back into a fire that never cooled. She didn't look up as he arrived, and her fingers didn't stop typing. She placed a new form on the counter and informed him flatly that due to a processing concern, they would need to validate the original account origin for security reasons. She spoke as if it were a minor inconvenience, as if dragging someone through an extra hour of procedure was no different than asking for a signature. She handed him a pen, then pulled it back slightly at the last second, her fingers recoiling as though contact might transfer something unwanted. Christian took the pen from her desk instead, the one that was chained to the base, its grip worn smooth from overuse. He filled out the new form as asked, knowing full well it was another layer in a game meant to test how long he could stand humiliation before reacting. As he stood writing, Cheryl reached down and retrieved a small spray bottle from beneath her desk, the label partially worn, the liquid inside faintly colored. She squirted the surface of the counter twice and wiped it down with a paper towel, scrubbing slowly across the spot where Christian's hand had just rested. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge him. But every motion she made was clear in its meaning. Christian paused his writing for the briefest moment, then continued, finishing the form with meticulous strokes, the pen gliding steadily even as the temperature in his chest dropped several degrees. He placed the completed form back on the counter, aligning it perfectly with the brass trim, then stepped back once more. Cheryl took it and set it aside without reviewing it. Her attention was already on the next customer, a woman in a navy coat who greeted Cheryl by name. They laughed about something insignificant as Christian returned to the edge of the room, once again relegated to the space no one else wanted. Moments later, a bank associate with a badge reading client support approached Christian with a strained expression. She wore glasses and a nervous half-smile, the kind of face that apologized before the words even arrived. She explained, as if reading from a training manual, that there had been some technical delays, and that processing his request was taking longer than normal. She apologized without meaning it, then asked if he would be comfortable waiting another 30 minutes. Christian responded with a slight nod, his jaw tight, his shoulders stiff. The associate thanked him and left quickly, her shoes squeaking faintly on the polished floor. Christian took a step closer to the window, peering past the sunlit glare at the traffic outside. A delivery van idled at the curb. A teenager on a bicycle zipped between two cabs. People walked in coats and carried bags and made plans. The world moved, and he did not. Inside the bank, Cheryl laughed again, her voice clear now, her posture more relaxed than ever. The man she was helping offered her a business card, and she accepted it with a gracious smile. She glanced toward Christian one more time, her expression unreadable, then returned to her screen. A moment later, the same security guard from earlier approached Christian again. He stood at a slight angle, just close enough to invade space without making contact. He asked if everything was all right in a tone that suggested it wasn't. Christian said yes. The guard lingered, then mentioned that some customers had expressed concern. He didn't specify what concern or which customers. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Christian didn't answer, didn't argue, didn't defend. The guard nodded and walked away, satisfied, or at least finished. Christian exhaled slowly. Every breath now felt like resistance. Every minute he waited was another minute of allowing them to test him, to see how deep the cuts could go before he bled. He had become a symbol to them, a test of patience, a measure of civility, a target with no voice. The transaction, the money, the paper, it had all stopped mattering. What mattered now was the performance of superiority. Cheryl had decided the moment he stepped forward that he was less. She didn't need proof. She only needed silence, and he had given it to her. Not because he agreed, but because he knew the cost of escalation. He had learned long ago how to stand without shaking, how to swallow words before they turned into weapons, how to survive in rooms where others made the rules and called it policy. And Cheryl Denning still ruled her counter with the detached ease of someone who believed the system would always favor her version of the story. She didn't need to shout or threaten. Her contempt worked silently, threading itself into routine tasks like venom in water. Christian stood silent, not because he lacked words, but because each time he had opened his mouth, the room had only grown colder. So he watched quietly, as the world around him filled with movement and intent that excluded him with flawless precision. Shortly after 1 in the afternoon, the branch's tempo shifted again as another wave of customers filtered in. A group of businessmen in long gray coats entered together, their voices low and confident, their faces taut with focus. They moved past Christian without acknowledgement, heading straight for the private teller window reserved for high-value accounts. One of them glanced sideways as he passed, taking in Christian's scuffed coat and tired stance before dismissing him with a half-smile that never reached his eyes. It wasn't malice. It was worse, it was amusement. The kind given to background actors in a stage too grand for their presence. The floor manager, a tall man named Curtis, who had yet to approach Christian directly, stood by the executive office door and looked in his direction for a beat too long. He whispered something to another employee and pointed subtly with his chin. The employee, a slim woman in a burgundy blouse, nodded and walked away with the practiced urgency of someone pretending to handle something urgent. No one brought updates. No one offered clarity. They only watched, observed, studied. Christian felt it in the room's rhythm. He had become a spectacle now. At 1:17 p.m., a woman in an emerald pantsuit took a place in line, her perfume rich with orange blossom and power. She caught sight of Christian standing near the brochures and narrowed her gaze, her lips pressing into a tight line. A moment later, she leaned forward and said something to Cheryl. Cheryl's smile didn't falter as she nodded slowly, then replied with words too soft to hear, but clearly tinged with mock empathy. The woman looked back at Christian once more, this time with open skepticism, then turned away. Cheryl continued her work as if the exchange had been a simple customer service note, but her next few glances toward Christian carried a sharper edge, as though daring him to misstep. Christian adjusted the sleeve of his coat, hiding the now-set stain behind a fold of fabric, not because it embarrassed him, but because it had become a symbol, one he didn't need the room to keep noticing. Across the lobby, the security guard leaned into the podium again, speaking into his shoulder mic while his eyes flicked toward Christian with calculated interest. He wasn't responding to a threat. He was cultivating one, not through confrontation, but through visibility. Christian's phone vibrated in his coat pocket. He reached for it slowly, the movement catching the attention of the man at the security podium. Christian glanced at the screen, saw a missed call from a blocked number, then silenced it without answering. He knew instinctively that pulling his phone out, using it, calling someone, any action perceived as assertion, might invite a new layer of scrutiny. So he left it in his pocket and returned his arms to his sides. Still, composed. At 1:32 p.m., a mother with 2 children entered, pushing a stroller and guiding a girl with braids toward the check deposit machine. The little girl pointed at Christian and asked loudly why that man was in trouble. The mother shushed her quickly, offering a tight smile of apology as she ushered the children away. Christian didn't react, not even to the child's innocence. He had grown used to being mistaken for something dangerous without ever moving a muscle. Then, for the first time since he entered the bank, the door to the manager's office opened. A young assistant stepped out, holding a clipboard, and looked directly at Cheryl. Their eyes met, and a signal passed between them. Cheryl nodded once, subtle and firm. The assistant walked across the floor, slow and deliberate, and approached Christian. She stopped a few feet away and spoke in a voice that tried to be pleasant but landed as patronizing. She informed him that the delay was due to the bank's internal fraud safeguards, which sometimes flag large withdrawals for clients who haven't recently updated their personal verification data. She didn't accuse. She didn't apologize. She simply suggested that perhaps he hadn't updated his profile recently, which might explain the extended delay. Christian, hearing the subtext, nodded once. The assistant smiled as if solving a technical error and promised to recheck the system. Then she walked back to the office and disappeared. The people nearby, having caught parts of the conversation, began whispering among themselves. Words like verification and fraud floated in the air like dust particles waiting to settle. The atmosphere had shifted again, not through volume, but through implication. Cheryl looked satisfied. She had not raised her voice. She had not made a scene. Yet the message had been delivered to the room. Christian was questionable. Christian was under review. Christian was not to be trusted. At 1:49 p.m., a courier entered with a package for the back office. The receptionist accepted it, then noticed Christian standing nearby. She didn't greet him. She didn't ask if he needed help. She simply looked at him, then looked away, as if trying to remember whether she had seen his photo on a staff warning bulletin. Christian shifted his weight again, this time out of necessity. His legs were beginning to lose their steadiness, and the silence around him had grown more brittle, more dangerous. Every time someone looked his way now, it was with suspicion wrapped in civility. He could feel the pressure building like a storm just behind his ribs, yet he refused to move more than he needed to. He had done nothing wrong. He had walked into a bank. He had followed every instruction. He had waited. He had complied. And still, he had become the center of a slow, quiet trial, with no judge and no jury. The walls offered no warmth, the windows no clarity, and the ceiling lights bathed everything in the sterile glare of manufactured civility. Cheryl Denning, still stationed at her post behind the counter, shifted her weight and sipped slowly from a paper cup, her pinky raised slightly, her gaze moving across the lobby with the easy rhythm of someone who believed she had mastered the choreography of superiority. She did not glance at Christian, not anymore, not because she had forgotten him, but because she no longer needed to look. He had become a permanent fixture, like the silent wall clock or the fake ficus plant wilting in the corner. The performance had changed. Now it was about sustaining the narrative, not proving it. And Cheryl had moved into the comfortable posture of someone convinced that her judgment required no validation. At precisely 2:06 p.m., a junior associate approached Cheryl and leaned in close, whispering something with a mix of caution and curiosity, and Cheryl responded without pause, her lips barely moving, her fingers tapping her monitor in slow, dismissive motions. The associate turned, looked toward Christian, then retreated, her face tight with uncertainty. Christian saw it all, not with paranoia, but with the clarity of a man who had learned to read intention not through words, but through breath, posture, and the speed of footsteps. He knew that whatever had been said was not in his favor, and he knew that any chance of fair treatment had long been replaced by quiet orchestration. At 2:13 p.m., Cheryl called him forward again. Her voice did not rise, did not welcome, did not offer acknowledgement. It simply announced. Christian walked to the counter without rush, without hesitation, his movements measured as if controlling each muscle were a necessary ritual to prevent misunderstanding. Cheryl placed a crisp white envelope on the counter, addressed to him in bold letters, and informed him in the most indifferent tone possible that the account he had requested to withdraw from had triggered an internal audit and would require a final signature. She pushed the envelope toward him with the same plastic pen she had used all day, then added that he would need to review its contents privately in the designated compliance area located near the employee hallway, and once finished, he could return the signed documents to her desk. She didn't explain why this protocol was different from the others or why this was the first he was hearing of it, but the message beneath her words was clear. Leave the front, go to the back, out of sight. Christian took the envelope and turned away. He walked past the teller booths and through the narrow hallway that led toward the staff break room and storage closet, escorted by another junior employee who avoided eye contact and said nothing beyond the bare instruction of which door to enter. The compliance room was small, windowless, and filled with a muffled hum of the bank's central ventilation system. It contained a table, 2 chairs, and a laminated sign on the wall listing the bank's privacy pledge. Christian sat down, opened the envelope, and scanned the document inside. It was a standard release form, written in firm legalese, stating that the requested withdrawal had raised procedural flags and required temporary consent for the funds to be held in a monitored ledger until all reviews cleared. There was no explanation for what those flags were, no timeline for clearance, and no reference to any specific violation. It was a stall tactic wrapped in polite deception, the kind that institutions designed to keep certain people compliant by smothering them in rules they couldn't challenge without legal assistance or visible defiance. Christian folded the document neatly, returned it to the envelope, and stood up. He knew the game now: delay, isolate, disorient. And he also knew that this room was not about privacy, it was about containment. As he stepped back into the main lobby, he caught a glimpse of Cheryl laughing with a male customer, her posture relaxed, her hands moving expressively as she shared some personal anecdote. The customer grinned, nodded, leaned in. It was a dance of comfort, familiarity, and trust, and Cheryl was leading with confidence. As Christian approached her counter again, her smile vanished. She accepted the envelope from him without a word, slid it beneath her keyboard, and stared at her screen. He stood there for 5 seconds. 10. Then she looked up and said the transaction was being escalated for regional authorization, and that someone would be in touch within the hour. Christian did not ask who. He did not ask how long. He turned quietly and walked back to the edge of the lobby. At 2:38 p.m., a cleaning staff member entered with a mop bucket and began sweeping the floor near where Christian stood. The man looked at him, nodded politely, then turned away without conversation. A few minutes later, another customer walked past, an older woman in a pale yellow coat, and gave Christian a look of polite confusion, as if unsure whether he was waiting for help or had simply gotten lost. Her face tightened when he didn't respond. Christian was used to this now. The looks, the distance, the assumptions. He had entered the bank dressed in precision, with papers in order, every credential intact, every step deliberate. Yet he had been stripped layer by layer of presence, of legitimacy, of self. He was not escorted out. He was not yelled at. But every person who looked at him now did so with the certainty that he had failed to prove something, and that was enough. At 2:51 p.m., Cheryl called him forward for what she called a preliminary release, informing him that part of the requested funds had been approved for release, while the rest remained under review. She placed a stack of bills on the counter, counted them slowly, one by one, slapping each note down like a card in a rigged game. When she finished, she pushed the money across the counter without a receipt, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of her pen. As the money slid across the polished surface, part of the stack slipped off and tumbled to the floor, scattering into 3 neat bundles at Christian's feet. Cheryl didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply looked at the money as if it no longer belonged to anyone. Christian bent down. His knees creaked, his coat folded awkwardly beneath him, and he gathered the money with slow, precise hands. He stood again, not quickly, not slowly, just completely, and looked across the counter. Cheryl had already turned to her next customer. It was not directed, not loud, not declared, but it was real, and it came from the breath of one of the junior staff who had earlier whispered behind his hand after speaking with Cheryl. Christian paused at the threshold, not turning back, not storming out, but merely standing there, as though waiting to see if anyone would offer a gesture of resolution, even a shallow one, but no one did. He looked ahead, past the glass into the world outside, the busy sidewalks and traffic murmuring with the afternoon rush, and for a single second he considered leaving, walking away from the insult, abandoning the rest of his funds, never returning to this building again, letting them keep the pieces of his dignity they had already chipped off and scattered across the lobby floor like forgotten coins. But then he remembered the pen Cheryl had refused to hand him, the form that served no purpose, the sanitized counter, the long minutes of being watched like an intruder, and the money on the floor. The money was the worst of it, not because he needed it, not because it mattered in isolation, but because of how she let it fall, because of how she looked away, because of the smirk she didn't even try to hide when it happened. That act, casual and cruel, had not been about procedure, it had not been about bank policy. It had been about putting him beneath the floor, not just on it. Christian turned from the door, slow and smooth, and walked back to the bench near the ATM kiosk, his eyes scanning the room like a man taking mental photographs, not of people but of patterns. Cheryl was once again helping a new customer, and her voice had returned to the artificial warmth she reserved for white clients in tailored suits, and Christian could hear her complimenting the man's tie, the pitch of her tone higher than it had been all day, her laughter light and performative. The man responded with a joke Christian couldn't make out, but Cheryl's burst of delight was clear and loud, designed for everyone to hear. Christian sat on the bench and quietly tucked the bills into the interior pocket of his coat, folding the edge of the lining to keep them from slipping. He sat upright, not leaning back, not relaxing, his knees perfectly aligned, his gaze never leaving the center teller row. He waited, not because he thought Cheryl would call him again, not because he believed the bank had suddenly remembered its obligation, but because leaving now would make this final insult permanent, and he would not carry it out of the building like a stain stitched to his spine. At 3:07 p.m., the assistant manager appeared, clipboard in hand, his hair slightly mussed, his shirt untucked in the back like he had been in a rush. He looked around until his eyes found Christian, then hesitated before walking over. His voice was lower than Cheryl's, more rehearsed, practiced to sound apologetic without ever being specific. He said that the transaction had reached a new level of review, something he described as a compliance buffer, and that a portion of the remaining funds had been approved for disbursement, while the rest would need to be held until an additional verification protocol could be satisfied. He explained this in vague terms, always emphasizing the word process, as if the delays were simply mechanical inconveniences rather than deliberate roadblocks. Christian asked for clarification once, and the assistant offered none. He instead said that Cheryl would finish the disbursement and that Christian should feel free to return to her station. Christian stood slowly and walked back toward the counter for the final time. Cheryl met him with a look that danced dangerously between boredom and satisfaction. She already had the cash prepared in a crisp white envelope, and she held it in her left hand while her right hovered over the keyboard. As Christian reached for the envelope, Cheryl pulled it back slightly and said that she would need one more signature, her voice deliberately louder this time, enough for the nearby customers to hear, the implication again clear. She wanted them to believe that something about this man required extra steps, more signatures, more controls. She placed a form on the counter and slid a new pen beside it. This time, she didn't flinch. She didn't sanitize. She watched him sign it, her eyes fixed on his fingers as if expecting them to twitch or tremble or reveal some deception. Christian signed with mechanical precision and placed the pen back down with care. Cheryl took the form, glanced at it, then said she would process it and mail a receipt to the address on file. She didn't offer the receipt now. She didn't say thank you. She simply handed over the envelope without eye contact, then turned to the next customer, a woman with a leather portfolio who received a bright smile and a warm welcome. Christian took the envelope, placed it in the same interior pocket as the first batch, and stepped away again. As he walked, he passed the same employees who had earlier whispered, the same guard who had watched him without stepping in, and the same poster promoting community trust and transparency that hung next to the exit. Christian exited the building at 3:23 p.m., his feet touching the pavement as if they had never left it, and the wind hit his coat, pushing the scent of the bank's cold air from his clothes. He kept walking, not looking back, not slowing down. It wasn't until he turned the corner, out of sight of the glass facade, that he stopped. He pulled out both envelopes and looked at them in his hands, neither of which now felt like success. The money was there. The transaction had been partially fulfilled. But nothing about the day had been about banking. It had been about proving that even silence could be broken, even dignity could be chipped away piece by people who smiled while they did it. But Christian's world had shifted slightly on its axis, not because of anger, not because of vengeance, but because he was no longer willing to play the part they had written for him. As he turned onto Sycamore Street and entered a narrow alley that led toward a backlot, he paused beside a gray dumpster and pulled out the envelopes, not to count the money, but to confirm its presence, to feel its edges, to remind himself that he had followed every rule, provided every form, met every request, and still been treated like a threat. The wind stirred the paper as he opened the flaps, and the smell of the bank, stale air and polished plastic, rose briefly before the wind carried it away. He folded the envelopes again, tucked them deeper into his coat, and looked up toward the skyline, where the Continental Union Bank Tower stretched into the clouds like a monument to selective welcome. He stared at it, silent and still, then turned and walked on. By the time Christian arrived at the apartment complex where he lived, a low-slung red brick building with iron railings and ivy creeping up the western wall, the sky had begun to dim, and the streetlights hummed with their usual flickering impatience. He walked past the first-floor mailbox panel, past the peeling paint on the corner stairwell, and climbed 2 flights to his unit without a sound. Inside, he hung his coat by the door, placed the envelopes inside a fireproof drawer beneath the sink, and sat at the small kitchen table without turning on the lights. The apartment was quiet, filled with the kind of stillness that allowed reflection to settle like dust. Christian sat for a long time, elbows on the table, hands folded, eyes fixed on the darkened window where his reflection barely flickered. He thought of Cheryl Denning's face, her hands, the way she looked past him as if his presence were a glitch in her otherwise curated reality. He thought of the way the guard watched him without reason, how the manager explained delays without truth, how the entire space was designed to let people like her feel powerful, while people like him were reminded, over and over, of their place. But Christian didn't curse them. He didn't growl or slam his hand on the table. Instead, he stood, walked into the hallway, and opened a locked cabinet hidden behind a false utility panel. Inside were 4 slim binders, a small network drive, and an encrypted laptop. He took the laptop, returned to the table, and powered it on. The screen glowed, the cursor blinked, and within seconds, files and scripts began to load. Christian Avery was not who they thought he was. He was not the man who stood in silence because he lacked the means to speak. He was not quiet because he was powerless. He had lived for years behind a curtain of anonymity by design, moving through the world with minimal exposure, not out of fear, but out of choice. His real name was Christian Avery Hightower, and he had once been one of the youngest financial cryptography specialists contracted by the Department of the Treasury, a strategist who helped build some of the very compliance systems that banks like Continental Union now use to delay and deny people like him. He had walked away from the public contracts, the headlines, the meetings, and taken with him not just the knowledge of how those systems worked, but the tools to reveal how easily they could be misused. He had left the spotlight, changed the way he dressed, chose neighborhoods where he wouldn't be recognized, and built a network of quiet influence that stretched from private advisors to regulatory auditors who still remembered his precision. Tonight, Christian logged into a secure server and began collecting records. Not illegally, not vengefully, just accurately. He knew the systems inside the bank. He knew the patterns that would reveal Cheryl's client prioritization behavior, the manager's delay tactics, and the use of internal flags that were designed to trigger without actual cause. He sent a discreet message to a former colleague at a Federal Review office, attaching a set of anonymized timestamps, teller interactions, and flagging inconsistencies pulled from Continental Union's publicly available API feeds. It would be enough to trigger an internal audit, not because of the money involved, but because of the compliance breach, the real kind, the kind regulators didn't ignore when it reached their desk with undeniable data. Christian then drafted a letter to the bank's corporate office, not from himself, but from the compliance advisory board of a mid-tier consultancy firm he quietly managed through proxy. The letter requested a formal investigation into discriminatory transaction handling practices, citing inconsistencies between procedure and behavior observed at the specific branch on the exact date and time of his visit. Attached were summaries of 5 prior incidents from public complaint forums that matched the exact behavioral pattern he had endured. He did not include his name. He did not make a personal appeal. He simply included facts, times, forms, delays, and outcomes. Compliance supervisors leaned over desks, their fingers hovering above keyboard shortcuts, murmuring about the curious precision of the attachments and the statistical signatures embedded in the flag behaviors. And as they reviewed the records of Cheryl Denning and her branch's approval times compared to customer demographics, the algorithmic disparity surfaced like oil in water, undeniable, uncomfortably clear, and difficult to explain without addressing the obvious. By 9 o'clock, the first conference call had been scheduled under the classification of performance review. By 10, Christian's file, buried beneath a network of disguised accounts, had reached the internal escalation queue labeled Anomaly Review, and though his name did not yet surface, the pattern of his case stood out like a flare in a cave. Christian, meanwhile, dressed deliberately. He selected a clean charcoal suit from the back of his closet, a piece he hadn't worn since he left public work, and he pressed the cuff smooth with one practice stroke before tying his tie in a Windsor knot with calm efficiency. He knew exactly how the day would unfold, not because he hoped it would, but because he had built its architecture with the same hands that once designed risk protocols for multinational banking conglomerates. The silence had served its purpose, but today it would step aside. As he stepped into the morning air, the weight of the previous day no longer clung to him. His shoulders were straight, his gaze forward, and each step toward the center of the city struck pavement with quiet precision. He entered a nearby cafe and ordered tea, not coffee, placing the request with the same level tone he had used when signing the final form in Cheryl's line. The barista greeted him with courtesy. The drink was prepared without delay, and for a moment, the world seemed to work as it should. By 11 o'clock, Christian entered a building 3 blocks from a bank, one that housed several law firms, accounting offices, and public affairs consultants. He took the elevator to the 6th floor and stepped into a shared suite he'd rented months ago under an alias used only for whistleblower investigations. The assistant at the front desk recognized him only by his appointment slot and smiled without judgment. Inside the office, he connected his drive to the secure network and monitored the escalation flags lighting up the compliance dashboard tied to Continental Union's internal risk logs. They were moving faster than expected. The delays were no longer being justified. The audit triggers had pulled the performance history of 5 tellers, all of whom showed a discrepancy in service times and withdrawal limits based on surname and withdrawal amount. Cheryl's data led the list. Christian composed a final report, stripped of emotion, built entirely from analytics, embedded with source data so concrete that denial would be negligence. He forwarded it to the Office of the Comptroller, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and 3 journalists known for investigating discriminatory banking practices. Then he closed the laptop, wiped the surface clean, and walked away from the desk as the first bounce-back alerts began to fill his inbox with automated acknowledgments of receipt. It was done. The system had been forced to see what it had chosen to ignore. At the same hour, inside the bank where it all began, Cheryl Denning felt something shift. The manager who had always supported her now avoided eye contact. The assistant who usually joked with her in the morning had gone silent. An email marked urgent summoned her to a meeting on the executive floor, one she wasn't expecting, and the moment she entered the glass-walled room, she saw 3 people seated, all with folders open, their expressions neutral. They asked her to sit, not with aggression, but with the formality that made the temperature in the room drop. They asked her about the incident the previous day, the one with a client she couldn't quite recall, the one who had filled out several forms, waited for hours, and received partial disbursements. She attempted to explain, but the folder on the table contained time-stamped footage, service records, and customer interaction logs that showed exactly how she had moved, spoken, and behaved. They asked again about the customer's name. She couldn't remember. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't argued. He had complied completely. Her silence, for the first time, did not shield her. Christian returned to his apartment that evening, removed the charcoal suit with the same methodical precision he had worn it, and placed it back into the dry-clean bag near the rear of the closet. He stood for a moment at the window, watching the lights of the city blink into existence as dusk covered the skyline in thin layers of blue and gold. He did not feel triumph. What he felt was equilibrium, the slow rebalancing of something that had been off-kilter for far too long. His name had not been mentioned. He had not spoken it. But it was there now, threaded invisibly into every system, every document, every analysis launched, because of the discrepancies he had made impossible to ignore. These weren't accusations shouted from rooftops or anonymous calls full of angry tones. These were data-driven indictments, formed through timestamps, decision logs, and algorithmic patterns that built a wall of truth brick by undeniable brick. The language was professional, cold, and exact, And it didn't scream injustice. It documented it with clinical indifference, which made it impossible to ignore and even harder to deny. The pattern was clear, repeated, and institutionally tolerated. Cheryl Denning entered the building that morning unaware of the full magnitude of the shift underway, her stride confident, her coffee cup warm in hand, her badge swinging with the casual pride of someone who believed herself insulated by routine and perception. But the elevator ride to the third floor carried an unusual silence. The assistant manager, who normally rode up with her, stood one step back, arms crossed, eyes on the lighted floor panel. She greeted him anyway, but he didn't respond. When she reached her station, her computer login required a second authentication she hadn't seen before. When she asked the support desk, the technician told her someone from compliance had temporarily locked several systems for audit review. Cheryl's brow creased slightly. Her fingers hesitated above the keyboard, but she dismissed it as a fluke. Then came the call at 9:02 a.m. She was summoned to the regional director's office without context, just a request marked immediate. She arrived to find not just the director, but two senior officers from the bank's legal and ethics division seated and waiting, their chairs spaced deliberately, their faces calm but uninviting. They asked her to sit. No small talk followed. They placed a printout in front of her, her teller logs for the past 6 months, and they began asking questions that were not rhetorical. Why were customers of certain profiles delayed longer than others? Why had identical withdrawal requests received different handling based on last names? Why were specific notes added to files only after interactions with clients of color? Cheryl stammered, tried to explain policy, tried to invoke security, but the printouts did not care for excuses. By 9:40 a.m., 2 other tellers had been pulled from their stations and placed on temporary administrative leave. The assistant manager, who had allowed the internal flags to be manipulated, was informed that a full investigation had begun into his oversight practices. Word spread down the hallway in whispers and darting glances. Phones rang in succession. Conversations stopped when people passed one another in corridors. Christian's report, never signed with his name, but clearly constructed by someone who understood their systems better than they did, had detonated a quiet implosion, and there was no cover from it now. The journalists who had received the data package followed up again that morning. They requested interviews, statements, clarification. One of them posted a tweet that simply said, "Systemic discrimination quantified. Stay tuned." Within the hour, the communications team for Continental Union received a media inquiry from a national outlet, asking for comment on a developing story regarding internal audit reports and racially biased banking practices. The PR manager responded with a templated statement, but it was already too late. The reporters had the logs. The numbers spoke louder than the defense. Christian sat in a quiet co-working lounge on the outskirts of the city, logged in through a proxy server, watching the digital footprint of the story expand in real time. Internal traffic on the bank's compliance portal had tripled in 2 hours. External regulators had requested official documentation of the flag cases. The whistleblower files, hosted on encrypted servers, had been accessed by 7 distinct agencies. He sipped water slowly, calmly, his suit jacket draped over the back of the chair, his laptop open to a console of progress indicators that flickered with precision. He had not revealed his face. He had not needed to. His silence had been his shield. The facts had done the speaking. At noon, Cheryl was escorted from the office, not in cuffs or scandal, but with quiet formality. Her personal items were boxed and handed to her by HR. Her access badge was deactivated. The performance reviews she once manipulated were now part of a binder presented to the ethics board. She left through the side door, her shoulders still straight but her pace slower, her face pale with a clarity she had not worn before. The colleagues who once laughed at her jokes now stared through her. By 2 o'clock, the bank issued an internal memo stating that several employees had been suspended pending investigation, and that the company was cooperating fully with federal oversight bodies. They framed the statement as a commitment to transparency and inclusion. But inside the branch, Everyone understood that the foundation had cracked. That same afternoon, a different branch manager, one from a neighboring location, reached out anonymously to the same journalists and confirmed that similar behavior had occurred under the same internal systems for years, and that no one had dared to raise it because no one believed it would matter. Now it did. Christian's architecture of evidence had made it matter. In the quiet days that followed the unraveling of Continental Union Bank's carefully protected facade, a strange calm began to settle across its branches, not the comfortable kind bred from routine, but the hollow kind that follows disruption, the sort that seeps into boardrooms and lingers behind frosted glass panels, the kind that forces people to speak softer, walk slower, and choose their words with unnatural caution. Inside the once confident corridors of the regional tower, conversations were clipped, and the once proud clatter of heels against tile had dulled to tentative footfalls, the sound of people learning to tread more carefully in a place that had finally been forced to reckon with its own reflection. Every screen now carried mandatory compliance modules. Every team was assigned an inclusion officer, and every meeting began with a statement about equity and internal review, not because minds had suddenly evolved, but because consequences had arrived and left behind smoke that still hadn't cleared. The weight of Christian's silent report had sparked more than embarrassment. It had triggered policy revisions, procedural overhauls, and a bank-wide demand for accountability that could not be dodged. His evidence was no longer theory. It was woven into the institutional memory, a permanent layer in the fabric of their governance. And even as they tried to move forward, that presence loomed just beneath the surface of every form, every decision, every interaction. Cheryl Denning no longer worked in finance. The final meeting she endured before her removal wasn't explosive or hostile. It was suffocatingly precise, conducted by professionals who had no desire to shame her publicly, but every intention of removing her privately, which, in the end, was far more punishing. She had thought the fallout would pass quickly, that she might explain her way out of the audit trail, blame it on procedural confusion or misinterpreted policy. But none of that stood in the face of what the record showed. She had been methodical in her treatment of certain clients, and now that method had been stripped of justification and laid bare. In the weeks after her dismissal, Cheryl struggled with the emptiness that followed her silence, not because she had lost her job, but because she had lost her illusion. She could no longer tell herself that she was fair. She could no longer hide behind the smile she had used as a tool. Her neighbors stopped waving as often. The friends who once invited her to weekend brunches drifted away with polite excuses. She applied for other positions, but each interview ended the same way, with questions about the investigation that never quite accused her of wrongdoing, but always left a stain she couldn't clean. Eventually, Cheryl found work at a community service organization through a distant cousin who knew nothing of the scandal. It was a small nonprofit in the south end of the city, underfunded and overworked, serving a population she had once judged without knowing. At first, she resented it. She saw the job as punishment wrapped in goodwill. But as months passed, something unfamiliar began to shift inside her. She began listening more than she spoke. She began learning names and stories she would have once ignored. The smiles she offered became slower, more human, less practiced. She did not change overnight. Her biases did not vanish. But the certainty she once held, the belief that she understood her place above others, began to erode with every shared conversation, every late night spent fixing paperwork for clients with nowhere else to turn. For the first time, she began to wonder not just what she had done, but why she had done it. Christian Avery never contacted Cheryl. He never sought an apology. He never posted his story, never attached his name to the reports that continued to circulate in policy seminars and HR training workshops. He knew better than to think that justice required applause. He knew that lasting change moved quietly and rooted itself in systems, not in headlines. What mattered was that the culture had been shaken, the structure cracked, and from its fracture something newer, less hostile, might eventually grow. Christian returned to his quiet routines, his long walks, his discreet consulting work done through aliases and encrypted channels, always building tools for transparency, always collecting truth from the shadows. He had not stopped being invisible. He had mastered how to weaponize it. One afternoon, many seasons later, Christian passed by the very same bank where the first insult had landed with the weight of a falling brick. The logo had been updated. The slogan outside now read something about inclusion and transformation. A new branch manager stood near the entrance, greeting people as they came in. The old coldness had been replaced by an overcompensation of warmth, almost theatrical in its friendliness. Christian stood across the street for a moment, hands in his pockets, coat collar turned against the wind. He watched the people move in and out, young and old, white and black, well-dressed and modest, and he didn't smile, not out of bitterness, but because what he saw was not resolution. It was the start of a long process that would need time, pressure, and the continued resistance of those who refused to be erased. Somewhere deeper in the system, the files Christian had seeded were now part of annual audits. His analysis was cited in internal banking journals. Colleges had begun to reference the case in lectures on systemic bias and procedural ethics. None of them used his name. They called him a source, an anonymous whistleblower, a compliance informant. But his presence remained in the code, in the training slides, in the policies being rewritten to prevent the next Cheryl from repeating the same behavior unchecked. At night, Christian returned to his apartment, smaller now, quieter, cleaner. He brewed tea and opened a book without checking the news. He didn't need to know how many articles had been written. He didn't need validation. He had done what was necessary. He had endured what too many others had endured, but he had survived long enough to reflect it back at them with a precision they couldn't deny. His silence had once been their comfort. Now, it was their consequence. The end. If you've been following Everett's journey and found the story compelling, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. I'd love to know what you think. What part of the plot hit you hardest? And which twist caught you off guard? Where are you watching or reading from? Drop a comment and let's talk about it. Your thoughts help shape what comes next.